Hi, today we're going to take a look at our Sony cameras, the NXCam 70U to keep it short. This camera is a step up from the Canons. It gives us more control and easier access to those buttons and menus that let us do things like set aperture, frame rate, adjust gain, and work with audio. All those things in a nice, easy-to-use package. The Sony can be intimidating for many students because there are so many more controls, and finding those controls is a bit of a challenge sometimes. But here's the thing to keep in mind. Once you understand the basic change from automatic to manual shooting, then it's just a matter of knowing what things are called and looking for those within the menus of a camera. So these are the key things you need to do once you get off automatic. You need to set white balance, frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, and maybe mess with the gain if that combination's not doing it. So let's take a close look at this camera and figure out how it works. The first thing I'll point out with this camera is that if you are working outdoors on a sunny day, you need to bring along a neutral density filter. And we keep those either in the camera room on top of the shelf or placed in each of the camera bags on the outside of the bag. The neutral density filter, or ND filter, screws onto the front of the camera, and to get that, you just remove the lens hood, make sure your lens and your filter are clean, hold it just by the edges, place it on top of the lens, and gently screw it in. You pop the shade back on, and you're ready to go. Now, if you're coming back inside, you'll want to make sure you pull that off, because if you don't, you will change a lot of your settings. But there are times when you want to leave this on. If you want to shoot with a wide open aperture, f1.8 or 2, so that you can get very shallow depth of field, lots of things out of focus, but your subject is sharp, leave this on. Then your exposures will force you to open the lens, and that'll give you that shallow depth of field you're looking for. It's just important to make sure you know when that neutral density filter is on and when it's not. And when I use one of these cameras, I always take a look so I know before I set exposure just what's what. So let's go ahead and take a look at this camera close up and just get a sense of what some of the possibilities are. I'm going to start with a bit of a mechanical tour of the camera itself. This has one ring, and this ring will focus, it will adjust zoom, and it will also control the iris. The trick is you just need to change this little switch depending on what you're doing. So if I want to use the ring to zoom, turn it to zoom, and now I'm zooming in and out with this ring. I don't do that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. If I want to focus with that ring, I just turn it to focus. I have a small focus button underneath, and whoops, I didn't need to push that button. I just turned the ring to focus, and it's now focusing. Now that little focus button there will sometimes sort of lock the focus in. If you start focusing and nothing's happening, just push that button. I can also change this to use the ring to adjust the aperture. And I've just turned the switch. I'm going to push that little button on the bottom that says iris. And now, whoops, I guess I didn't need to push the button. Sorry about that. So I just pushed it again, and now I'm using this ring to secure my exact aperture. One of the nice things about this is that if I'm recording right now, I can actually change the aperture while I'm recording. I just have to be careful to make sure I know it's on the iris and not focus. because I don't want to change my focus while I'm shooting, thinking I'm actually fixing the exposure. Okay, so on this side of the camera, on the top is an iris autofocus button. I can push that. The camera will give me what it thinks is a auto exposure. If I don't like it, I can push it again and it'll just slightly change that exposure. I find that it's not great. It works, but it's not my preference. Those are the mechanics of the camera. Let's look at the menus. We'll start over here with Record Media Set. And this gives me everything from the ability to format the camera. I think it's like 32 gigabytes or 64 hard drive to record on. Tells me I'm recording HD in the internal memory, and I can change that to put a memory card in there if I choose to. I can also pick the format I'm recording in, and this camera lets me record in everything from 60 frames per second to 30 frames per second. I really like 30 frames per second. I can even go down to 24. 30 frames per second is kind of the web standard, so I'm going to keep that. But I will check something else in a minute. I can look at the shooting mode, movies, and that tells me two things. My shutter is on manual, and I've set it to 60. And my gain is also manual. If you were to put the gain to automatic, then whenever you adjusted the aperture, the camera's going to raise or lower the video gain, depending on what you're trying to do. And it'll really change your exposures quite a bit. So my camera is pretty well set to go. I know I'm at 60 frames per second. I know that my gain is on manual. And one of the first things I want to do is set the white balance. So let's go back to the menu, Camera Audio, and white balance is right here. I will push this. I have Auto, which it's currently on, Outdoor, Indoor, which is not very good. It's actually tungsten lighting, and we don't really have that, and a setting for one push. I've put a white balance card straight ahead, and I'm going to zoom in to fill that frame. And I'm going to go ahead and set it. And it's now completed that process. If I back out, I've got a good white balance. I'll push OK and be on my way. So now, let me get a shot here. I just need to check a few things. I can see that f3.1 is highlighted here. That tells me that this ring right now is controlling the iris. But let's say I want to, let me get a shot. I'm actually going to zoom in on these pencils. Actually, I'll zoom in on that far computer. And let's say I'm going to use this ring to adjust focus. Let me just move this out of the way for a second. Whoops, here we go. So now I'm adjusting the focus. I have that nice and sharp. If I didn't want to use the ring, I could use the focus button, which is right under this ring. And let me go ahead and push that. You'll see what happens. That's sort of an autofocus, and I just pushed that button, and it came up with the focus to that distance. Now, it may or may not be perfect. I actually think it needs a little fine-tuning. But one thing I can do to fine-tune this a little bit is I have an expanded focus button right underneath. I'm going to push that. And now, let me just push it again so you see the difference. So that's my shot. When I push it, it automatically magnifies this. So now I can get a really sharp focus. I think I've nailed it. I just verified by the distance. It said 3.2 meters, which is close. But that's not my shot, so I really need to push this button again. And then it puts my shot back in perspective. If I left that expanded focus button on, and let me just see if, yeah, if I left it on and recorded, that's not what I'd be recording. That's just a magnification. That's what I'd be recording. So it's really key to know if that's on or not. And the last thing I'm going to do is use the iris function. Now, I can, let's just see if I can do that. I can go ahead and just push this iris button and leave that switch where it is. And when I did that, nope, I have to actually change that little switch to iris. Sort of a pain. And I'll push that iris button so I know I'm highlighted. Now my ring is controlling exposure. I can also use this iris button up here. So those are my options. I don't use the switch to zoom. The reason why is because it's already tricky enough adjusting focus and iris with that. So I prefer to leave zoom out of the equation, and I'll use the toggle switch up here on top of the camera so that I can do that. Those are the highlights of this camera, and when you think about it, there's not much different in this camera from anything else. The question is where things are and how I find things. One thing I do want to show you with this camera, you have time codes, which we're not really talking about yet, but in the camera audio section, this camera has what's called white balance shift. And if you set a white balance and you're not totally happy, you can adjust it by tiny increments, just adjust the white a little bit. That's very helpful. If you go back to that menu, we'll just zoom down a little bit. Steady shot. Steady shot is a feature in the camera that will help compensate if you are shaky or you're moving a little bit. If your camera is on a tripod, it's great to turn that off so that it's not trying to offset the movement. But once you do that, it's key to know that it's been turned off, and you might have to check to make sure to turn it on again, because it's a pain not to use some of these features. Volume is volume of the headphones, has nothing to do with what you're recording. So those are the features. Let's look at audio quickly. Audio works just like the Canon. In fact, it works like most cameras. We have our XLR, which is attached, plugged into channel 1. And I'm going to really hope that you will leave this microphone right where it is. You shouldn't unplug it and take it off the camera completely. If you're going to unplug it to use input 1, just unplug it and tuck that XLR out of the way someplace. You can even let it hang down, as long as it's not banging the camera. So once you flip this up and you have a mic plugged in, you have all the same controls. You're selecting channel 1, if that's all you're using, or channel 1 and 2 if you have 2 mics in. You have an attenuator switch, ATT, which we already know, and we already know what that means, right? That cuts your audio, so you leave that at 0 unless you're working at a concert. We have input 1, and we're going to run this microphone on phantom power, that's plus 48 volts. But if I'm running a lavalier, I'm going to pop it to mic so I don't have any hiss. Whoops, I'm sorry. So this is, you got to think vertically now. So this is the auto or manual. I'd put it on manual and make your decisions about levels. We'll talk about that as well. And if you only have one channel running, then it's really helpful to put input 2 up to line. What that will do is that will cut any possibility of any other interference. Finally, the last thing is a low cut filter. And what that does is if you are working outdoors and it's windy or there's a hum or something like that, there's actually a hum in here. If you pop that on, it'll reduce some of those lower frequencies. And that is really about it. The way you learn how to use this camera is by playing with it. So If you haven't used one of these, or you've only used it on automatic, I think it's probably time to pull this off auto and see what it does. So that's the run through, and that's the Sony NX70U. There are quite a few features, and like I said, when someone's been used to using the Canon, using this camera is a little bit intimidating, but I've really got to tell you, I think the benefits of using this far outweigh the fear factor. So go ahead and get one out of the cabinet, pop it on manual, open it up, start going through the menus, and look for those familiar things that you already know. Things like gain, white balance, aperture, settings. See what the camera's putting on auto, and see what you can put on manual and shoot some great stuff. Thanks.